Sarah Taylor, as we have learned a lot about, is the Executive Director of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security. This group was formed in 2000 to call for a Security Council resolution on women, peace and security, which of course later materialized. And now you are working full-time, I understand, implementing this resolution and following up on it. So please.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm not sure I should thank Cynthia for raising expectations that are far too high. I'd really like to thank the organizers, my co-panelists and the chair. And yes, of course, to all of you here for what I'm really hoping will be a robust discussion, has already been a robust discussion, and I'm looking forward to that continuing over the next couple of days. You know, by way of background, of course, Cynthia has already laid so much of this out for us already. Just a little bit of scene setting about the work that we do at the NGO Working Group and why we're doing what we're doing. And we're working within the context of this growing understanding of this relatively recent understanding of what has always been true, which is that wars are gendered and conflict is gendered. And there is a gender dimension to these conflicts that is not incidental, but is actually fundamental to the ways that conflicts come about, the way that wars are fought and resolved, and the work that we need to do to rebuild from work. And, you know, the sort of tropes of war and the mythologies of war that once you start looking at them are so distinctly gendered, it's taken us a really long time to recognize the fact of that purposefulness of that gendering, the fact that that is not incidental. The more and more academic work, the more and more policy work that has gone into recognizing and trying to address that purposefulness or that non-incidentalness of the gendered nature of conflict has really increased with startling rapidity over the last sort of 15 years or so. As mentioned, the NGO Working Group, which is the group that of 16 international NGOs that I coordinate, you know, our group came together before I started there in 2000 to help harness this sort of global push for a Security Council resolution, which was 1325, adopted unanimously in 2000 for a Security Council resolution on women, peace, and security. And that itself was the result of several world conferences on women that had had a growing recognition of the gendered nature of war and conflict. It was itself the sort of product of the Beijing 95 World Conference on Women that had in Section E of the outcome document deals specifically with some of the gendered components and specifically the impact of conflict on women, and the fact that the sort of way this breaks down is, you know, women face particular protection concerns, are impacted and experience particular types of violence during conflict. They're simultaneously, the work that they do preventing conflict is not recognized. They're excluded from efforts to resolve conflict and are often excluded and kept out of programs to rebuild post-conflict. So those sort of core components are at the work that we do in New York, pushing the Security Council, which has been so much part of the discussion that we were having this morning, pushing the Council and other policymakers to recognize that at the core of this mandate on international peace and security, the maintenance, we would say, the assistance, maintenance of international peace and security must be what can feel like this abstract discussion around the gendered nature of conflict. And so what I wanted to do today was to talk a little bit about, a little bit more concretely about women, peace, and security, and of course, you know, women's rights in the context of conflict and intervention, because I think we really need to challenge ourselves when we're talking about intervention and make sure that we're not once again forgetting to do a gendered analysis of the issue of intervention. So I'm going to ask you to keep 3 questions in mind as I'm just going through some examples of interventions over the last decade or so. Some more recent than others, and some are actually within the same country, or some are actually exventions, I guess. And those 3 questions are in this, are sort of generally this. What are the conditions under which we as an international community recognize that women's rights are at the core of peace and security to the degree that this prompts some kind of intervention? In other words, what is done in the name of women or in the name of women's rights? When do we as an international community not take this action, despite a clear need and responsibility to act specifically regarding women's rights? In other words, what is not done in the name of women's rights? And finally, when do we as an international community act or not act on behalf of, instead of at the behest of, or in partnership with, the women and the communities that we are talking about? In other words, how often are we culpable of making policies, of holding negotiations, of taking decisions, of designing programs that are about them instead of with them? When are women prevented from doing things and participating in these actions in their own names and in the name of their own rights? So I'd just like you to hold those questions in your head as we're sort of going about this. I also wanted to quickly address one issue that was raised this morning, which was an issue around rights and the idea of interventions as being something that is, or human rights in the context of imposing rights on another culture or on another community. And I just really want to talk about the issue of women, peace, and security. This is a question that we get asked about a lot. And whether we and particularly me, as the face of the NGO working group, clearly coming from a Western tradition, whether we are actually imposing a Western cultural norm on these communities. I really want to emphasize that the Women, Peace, and Security agenda and the fact that this realization and movement around women, peace, and security comes from women in their communities globally. The similarities and the demands that these women make are startlingly similar. Women face startlingly similar barriers to participation and have startlingly similar asks and demands, but these demands come from these communities. We're asked, aren't you trying to impose your values on Afghanistan or on Libya? And my answer is always no, because the message that I bring to council members in New York is the message that those women are giving to me. I'm not putting words in their mouths. These are the things that they are demanding that I bring to the council because their own governments are not listening to them. Their representatives, they're making the demands on their representatives as well, but their representatives are not listening to them and listening to their demands. So I just really want to clarify that this was something, one of those rare creatures in international policy, where this was a demand that started at the grassroots, filtered its way up, and ended up at the top in the Security Council, if you want to call that the top, and is now starting to filter its way back down. So I just really want to make that clear. I'm going to run out of time. Okay, what time did I start? 10 minutes left. Oh, good. Okay, good. So I just would like to go through a couple of country situations. I think the first one I'd really like to start with is probably one of the more obvious ones, and that's Afghanistan. And that's an example, obviously, of an intervention that was actually done clearly. There was so much emphasis on the need for an international intervention, so largely because the women of Afghanistan's rights were being abrogated, and that we as an international community needed to go in and help these women. Regardless of where you stand on that particular issue, I'd like us all to take a look at where we are now. And I think that this gets to the point of what we're talking about an intervention. When you go to try to improve a rights situation, can you militarily, with a solely military purpose, without a consultative process, with a short-term approach, modify a situation such that the situation is actually better for women's rights? I think that we find ourselves, the women of Afghanistan find themselves in a situation right now where they are incredibly concerned about what's going to happen in 2014 when the international community starts to leave. I think you look at the attacks on women's human rights defenders, murders of women human rights defenders, particularly at the leadership level. We had a huge, tragic December in Afghanistan. A number of women were assassinated just for the fact that they are actually women human rights defenders. Sexual violence is still a huge problem in Afghanistan. There are laws on violence against women. Those laws are not implemented. Women are really targeted in Afghanistan. So I think when it provides one of the most obvious cases for what's done in the name of women, but at the same time needing to ensure that we're actually following through on, if we're going to do something in women's name, we need to make sure that we're actually doing these things for women, not using women's rights as an excuse for a military intervention for another purpose, but rather thinking through what is it that's actually going to improve the status of women in their communities. I'd like to talk about a different kind of intervention, and I'm not sure how many of you are up to speed with the revision of the United Nations peacekeeping mandate in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But that mission mandate was actually recently revised to contain something that is actually extraordinary, has never been done before. In addition to it is the largest, if I'm not mistaken, peacekeeping force mandated by the UN Security Council. And that mandate was actually recently revised to include an intervention brigade. Now, this is the first time that a UN peacekeeping force has actually been mandated to take military action, to be an active engager in an armed conflict. The situation in the DRC is complex, is fluid, is ongoing. But this is an intervention. There's the violence there, including horrific attacks on women, high levels of sexual violence and conflict, abrogations of women's rights. Again, once again, women have been completely, often, repeatedly left out of, as have many other groups, have been left out of and actively excluded from peace agreements, trying to resolve the situation. Displacement levels from the violence that's taking place in North and South Kivu. But there's now going to be an actual intervention brigade, a blue helmet intervention brigade. The concern here is, where is the thinking around what that intervention brigade, an additional military actor in an already highly militarized area, what are going to be the ramifications, particularly for women who are so vulnerable already? Will they face additional displacement challenges? What are the services that are going to be in place for them when there are so few services already in an incredibly low capacity environment? What are the opportunities, and what has been the consultation there for something that is so untested? This is something so new. It's my ringtone. The third example I'd like to give is that in Mali. More than a year ago, there was a coup in the capital of Mali, a political crisis that was compounded by the outbreak of armed violence in the north. The outbreak of armed violence in the north was part of that, a large part of that was, of course, gender-based violence and sexual violence, including sexual violence and conflict. Women organized rapidly. There's actually a very strong women's civil society movement in Mali. They're very politically active. They mobilized immediately around the coup, seeking to be part of the civil society movement that was seeking an end to the political crisis there, raising the alert around the sexual violence in the north. Unfortunately, those groups found it extremely difficult, despite being very politically active, despite being very politically organized, found it extremely difficult to gain access to the negotiations to resolve the political crisis, were sorely underrepresented and only managed to get represented after, shall we say, pulling quite a few strings and sort of forcing down the doors rather than knocking on the doors to the mediation and negotiation attempts. There's been an intervention by France. The United Nations is currently in the final stages, it's understood, of rehatting some of the troops that are already in place, some of the troops that are already in place from ECOWAS and AU, I believe it is, into a United Nations peacekeeping force there. And once again, the question has to be asked, what has been the consultation with those women's groups? Has there been consultation with those women's groups about what needs to happen in a mandate for another UN peacekeeping mission there? Excellent. For another UN peacekeeping force there. Will women be part of the political solution that the UN acknowledges needs to be a major part of that mandate? Will the troops there, this is a key issue, will the troops that are going to be brought into this force, will they be vetted for prior violations of human rights to ensure that we're mitigating any potential for additional human rights violations by another armed actor in Mali? Again, so I will wrap up as I've been given the 2-minute warning. I'd like to refer to my colleague from India's point this morning or this afternoon, who made the point that about development in the context of development, which is that development efforts that are poorly planned can be worse off for can make conditions worse for those who are poor. It can actually make them poorer. And I'd just like to make the point that despite the best of intentions, interventions that are poorly planned can make things worse for those for whom we're trying to intervene. And that holds true particularly when we're talking about women's rights. Women's rights are, and women are, as we know, and this is why we have a resolution on women, peace, and security. This is why we have the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. This is why we need particular attention regarding women's human rights, because women tend to be one of the more vulnerable groups, particularly or at-risk groups, particularly in times of conflict. And I'd also like to talk about the fact that the responsibility to protect is incredibly important, but just to remind us that as we're talking about the third pillar, military intervention is not our only option, and that we need to be looking at the entire toolkit, that we need to be holding the Security Council. This is, of course, my work, so I'm going to talk about the Council, but the Council needs to be held accountable for its entire range of tools in its toolkit. It needs to be held accountable for addressing women's human rights whenever it's talking to its special envoys and mediators. It needs to be asking questions about women's human rights when it gets briefings from its SRSGs. They need to be holding women's rights as part of the prevention efforts, small though they are, that it engages in. They need to be demanding that gender be part of its disarmament, demobilization, reintegration programs. All of those things, even though they don't sound like intervention, are issues that ensure that women's rights are embedded in all efforts at conflict resolution, post-conflict rebuilding, and hopefully conflict prevention, all of which we would hope mitigate the need for intervention in the first place. I'm going to conclude. And I'm going to leave you, and I hope we can have a robust discussion about this, as I say, just by reiterating those 3 questions that I posed to you at the beginning. What is done in the name of women's human rights? What is not done in the name of women's human rights? And what are women being prevented from being done in their own name? So with that, I thank you very much, and I look forward to a great discussion.